So I've been asked to talk about the early history of UNAVCO. It's really very boring and dull, so I'm going to talk about death and destruction. And an early wish in UNAVCO was that the use of geodesy would in fact save lives, and in particular through the study of the strain fields that develop before earthquakes. And 40,000 people a year die from earthquakes even now. So one of the things we need to look at is how we got there. Well, here's a paper that we wrote, Yates and Zabini and I, and it was followed only a week later by Isaac Asimov, who said, can geodesy save lives? And he said yes. So here we are, endorsed by Asimov. However, I've been working a lot with Nick Ambrasis, who sadly passed away last year, and he says, no, earthquakes, nothing to do with geodesy, it's to do with buildings falling down. And so the rest of this talk is actually going to talk about why buildings kill people and whether in fact we're making any headway on this. And my conclusion is that we're probably not. The next graph will actually show you how, in fact, come on, next graph, goodness me. And there we are. So the purple line, the violet line, is the population growing. At about 1850 it kicks off, goes completely bonkers. But earthquakes, they take off at the same time, but not as much. So perhaps we're doing quite well. Perhaps, in fact, the risk to people on our planet is reducing. And this, in fact, proves it. Look, the blue line now is the number of people killed cumulatively from earthquakes normalized to the instantaneous population. And you can see that when sanitation and medicine kicks in, suddenly there's less earthquake risk because there are more people. Now, that's not true in many countries of the world. If you look in Iran, Italy, Turkey, and so on, you get graphs where, in fact, the number of people dying from earthquakes is not reducing at all. In fact, this is appalling. And so let's have a look at what's going on. Here is Asimov's view, or our view, of what we do. We do all sorts of interesting earthquake science, and we feed that information in the form of seismic hazards to the engineers. And the engineers take that information, throw it into all sorts of statistical studies, and come up with earthquake risk mitigation. They build bridges and schools and banks and apartment blocks and so on. But notice that little grey area there? That little grey area is what earthquakes do. They do it in. They're basically knocking down all the buildings that are not being built by engineers. So there's a link in the chain that's missing, and it's still missing. In fact, if you look at the last dozen earthquakes, they all look the same. They all look like this. Buildings collapsing, and basically it says earthquakes are not interested in earthquake engineering and geodesy and the things that we do. They simply go for the weakest link. And here's a measure of our failure. This is what we can do within 10 or 20 minutes of an earthquake. We can say how many people are dead. Okay? Before, many times weeks before people know how many people are dead on the ground. So here's the problem. Earthquakes destroy buildings. The world's poor live in buildings that they've constructed or rent from people that have built them badly, sometimes built by the government. Because of corruption, the buildings are not up to standard. And if you don't believe me, here's the corruption index against the income of people. You'll notice there's a linear correlation. It's log, of course. But notice there are 9 seismogenic regions that are worse than they should be in terms of their gross domestic product. And if you plot those nations on a graph like this, you find that 85 of all deaths from earthquakes occur in poor countries that are more corrupt than they should be. And I'm talking about places like Italy, not just India. But here's a map. The southern edge of the Eurasian plate is the place where 80% of all people die in earthquakes, and they will continue to die. And you'll notice the corruption index gets to very, very low values in that central region. So what is my point? Are we winning or are earthquakes winning? The answer is that we're putting a huge amount of effort into geodesy and seismology and paleoseismology, all those disciplines that we love and in fact do very well, I think. The engineers are taking our information and putting that information into building structures that are not lived in by most of the world. And so the real problem is we have to somehow form this last link between people living in buildings that are certainly going to fall down and what we know about earthquakes. And that's it.